Everyone, it's Lisa from Been There, Got Out, and tonight's guest is Marnie Grundman. She's a TikTok superstar. She's a trauma expert. She's a therapist. She deals a lot with people who are coming from narcissistic families. And the topic that we're going to talk about tonight, let me just see if she's here, has to do with, in particular, I don't see her yet. In particular, when someone is going through a court battle and their toxic ex sort of aligns with the toxic people in their family and turn against them while they're in the legal system. There she is. Okay. Whoop. 1 second. Marnie, I'm just going to get you in here in a second. I forgot to say that Marnie's also an author. But anyway, so we started talking about, hi.
Hi.
I was just introducing you and I was saying that the topic that we were going to get into came from one of our clients who it turns out is certainly not the only one dealing with this. But this person was talking about how she's going through this court battle and she feels more alone than anyone because not only does she have this narcissistic ex, but this person has aligned with her parents who she's been no contact with for years and turned against her. And she feels like she's going to be the one who looks crazy because she doesn't have anyone. And I think when you and I did our TikTok collaboration a couple of weeks ago, I was thinking that the title of it should be "No One Has Ever Been There for Me," because you think that when you're dealing with one of the hardest things that anyone has to deal with in terms of going through the court system in a high conflict situation, that at least you should be able to have family to rely on. And so many of our clients don't have anybody. So you want to talk about that a little bit? Because I know we have a whole bunch of things we want to talk about. And thanks for coming back. And also introduce yourself again, Marnie.
Thanks for having me back. So my name is Marnie Grundman. I am a survivor of a mother who was a sociopath and a narcissist. And of course, relationships that were with people who were also narcissistic. I'm also a domestic violence survivor. I married somebody when I was 19 who was violent. And I'm an author of a book, and I'm also a therapist that specifically deals with survivors of narcissistic abuse and moreover survivors of narcissistic abuse in childhood. And oftentimes, as many of us know, when you have a parent that was a narcissist or narcissistic or toxic or emotionally violent in particular, oftentimes the relationships that we enter into, both romantically and even in friendships, mimic those same foundational relationships because they are familiar to us and they are the language that we speak. That is the kind of love that we know. That's what we know love is supposed to look and feel like. So we end up in relationships in our teenage years even and adult lives with people who are exactly like the people who raised us until we figure out that that's not actually love and that that's not healthy. And unfortunately, because we come from that dynamic, we come from a dynamic that does not have a support system. And so when we're going through the hard times with that partner, or it's domestic violence, or we're going through a divorce, of course we don't have anyone because we actually never had anybody, which is also why it feels so lonely because, you know, you're alone. You're on your own in a way that other people are not.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that came up during our last conversation was the sense of someone feeling like I'm not good enough. And you talked about how those, you know, again, with childhood, that we're dealing with big issues like betrayal, that when you get back in the court system or you get into the court system, it triggers a lot of that same stuff that you had from childhood, feeling like, you know, no one's there, I'm not good enough, I'm not worthy of love. Do you want to talk about that a bit?
Yeah, I'm not, well, you know, I mean, think about this. You're born into a family that is emotionally abusive, or maybe abusive in other ways as well. But it's the emotional abuse in dealing with my clients that is the longer lasting of all the abuses in terms of trying to untangle the messages that we learned about who we were and who we are. So when you're being emotionally abused, what you're being taught is that you aren't worthy, that you aren't good enough, and that you have to work very hard to earn love and approval. And it never actually happens, because it's that carrot that's just always going to be a little bit out of reach. And in the moments where you think you're actually getting there, where that parent or parents is actually love bombing you, is sucking you in, really all they're doing is grooming you so that they can control you that much more and hit you harder. So it's kind of a spin out kind of thing that keeps on happening, or an up and down and a push and pull. So when you grow up like that, every single day, every single moment is like walking on minefields. And so the triggers aren't like one big thing that you can go, this is really tangible. It's the triggers of the moments that the abuse is happening, and it's the trigger of waiting for the abuse to happen and measuring everything outside of yourself to try to figure out how to navigate the room without creating, as if it's our fault, another episode of the actual abuse. Now go into the courtroom with all of those things that you don't even have in a tangible way that are triggering you, and get asked a question and figure out how you're going to show up. It's very, very, very difficult. It's very difficult to learn the skill of, okay, I'm just going to take a breath, because you feel the pressure of having to respond in that moment. And how should I respond? I want them to like me. It goes back to all those things. And inevitably, you're going to forget maybe what you're there for, or what you really want to say, because you're being so stimulated in these wounds that run so deep. So that feeling of helplessness, you kind of are helpless in that moment. And we have to learn skills to bring ourselves present, and also to be very patient with ourselves, to know that, okay, I'm allowed to take a breath. I'm allowed to take a moment before I respond. That's going to serve me. And that's a skill that, you have to learn for sure. It's not that easy.
Yeah. Yeah. As you were talking, it made me think of something that I don't think we spoke about in our last conversation, but I know that one thing that our clients and so many of in our community are feeling is an overall sense of dread. And it's this feeling of like, I have to be the perfect parent, because if I do anything wrong, this X is going to get my kids taken away. So every little message, I have to answer it perfectly. I have to, and it makes me think about the child who grew up with this. You want to get into that at all? I'm sure you can relate to that.
It's the perfect storm, right? I mean, that's the perfect storm of the triggers and everything that we're worried that they're going to see in us. Because until you've really gone through the healing process, we expect people to think badly of us, which means that we have to be that much more perfect, which means that we can't be human. Nobody is perfect, right? And we're not going to, I don't believe, lose our children because we're not perfect. If we lose them in those situations, it's because perhaps we didn't do the work that we need to do to be able to be articulate and show up for ourselves, and focus so much on borrowing the trouble and the outcome that we weren't present in what was unfolding at the time. And again, it's really understandable, because we're back in that position of trying to earn something, of trying to prove something, and we're not even sure if we're right because of all the gaslighting that we've also experienced. So the self-doubt really runs deep.
Yeah, and I always like to bring up this quote from another guy I interviewed named Steve the Bodyguard. He said, an abuser's greatest tool is fear. And I feel like that's what happens in these cases. There's this terror of like, something bad is going to happen. They're threatening to, they're threatening to use my weaknesses against me, and I'm going to be exposed for, not just not being perfect, but being a terrible person. Like underneath, I must be this terrible person, and I believe what they're saying. Yeah. And again, it's like, that's what they grew up with. That's what a lot of us grew up with.
Yeah, well, that's the messaging. And think about it this way, for a child who's being abused, when we get home from school and we put our hand on the doorknob, in that moment, our conditioning is to go, ooh, what's waiting on the other side, and play out every scenario as we're slowly walking into that house. So going in that courtroom, that is exactly the same thing. We are playing out every single, and anytime we're triggered for that matter, we are playing out every scenario. We are ruminating. We are going on the hamster wheel. We might be even having conversations out loud of like practicing and trying to alleviate that. I call them mock conversations, trying to alleviate that anxiety. But what it's actually doing is it's building on it. And if we can learn things like, I always tell people, don't borrow trouble, because you don't know what's going to happen. You can't control the outcome, but you can control who shows up there, how you show up. And if you can turn that inward and focus on the things that you need to do to show up, instead of worrying about how it's going to, you know, maybe or maybe not come out, you're going to feel a lot more powerful, a lot more relaxed, a lot less exhausted, and therefore you're also going to be a lot more effective.
Yeah, and the word that we use is, we use a couple, catastrophizing and awfulizing. And I do it all the time myself, even after all of these years in court and doing really well and being self-represented. It's like, I'm still, part of me is like, well, what if the judge changes their mind? Or what if when I go back to get what I'm due, something terrible happens and we have to redo the whole thing? And it's just that, again, like, what if my story is never heard? What if the truth never comes out? Yeah. And one of the techniques that I learned from my daughter's therapist at the time years ago, because I was getting so stressed out. We had been to court time after time and nothing was progressing. And I didn't know what to do. And so she said, and she was a great therapist. So I figured, well, I'm here anyway, dropping my daughter off. Maybe she'll give me 5 minutes. And she did. And she said, well, what are you so worried about? And I was like, I feel like I'm never going to have a chance to speak. Like, they're never going to listen to me. And then she said, okay, let's try to make almost a chart where here's the fear, like, I'm never going to be heard. And now let's do, I can't remember what the column was called, but like the reality of it. And she said, I haven't been heard yet. My story hasn't come out yet. And just adding that one word at the end, it calmed me down, because it's like, that's true. Like, I haven't been heard and I'm freaking out about it, but I just haven't been heard yet. And I was heard. It took several more times in court, but I was heard. And that made everything feel better. So we encourage our clients to use that tool also with, like, what's the worst thing? What's the worst thing that you think could happen?
Yeah.
Say it. Let's get it out. And then let's say, what's a way to kind of spin it so that it might not be the worst thing ever.
Yeah, I use that all the time, actually, in my
really?
practice. Like, what's the worst thing that can happen? Yeah.
Really?
Because you're so focused on the activity and the possible outcome, but you're not really thinking about the outcome.
Yeah.
You know, it's the anxiety of getting there.
Yeah. I just saw, a lot of times I don't pay attention to the comments because I'm busy, I'm focused on you, but I see one that I think you might want to say something about, that I think many people can relate to, saying that my worst fear is ending up just like my mom and or passing my trauma down to my kids.
Okay, well, I mean, if your mom is a narcissist or purposely toxic, that's not a worry. The fact you're worried about that tells me that that's likely not going to happen.
Right.
You know, it's like when somebody says, what if I'm the narcissist? I'm kind of like, they don't ask that question, so we're good now. We do pass on some of our trauma. We do. You know, we do through the relationships that we have. That's not the same thing as actively abusing your child. But because we do repeat some things in the instability of our own life and the way that maybe we handle certain situations, I think it's important to understand that it's almost impossible not to pass down some of your trauma and what that looks like. But on the flip side of that, it isn't the passing down of the trauma that needs to be the thing that's long lasting. It's how you handle those moments and what you do with that, how you communicate to your children, how you take ownership, how you work on your own healing journey to make sure that you're minimizing that pass down and keeping that communication open and making sure that you are building a foundation where your children know that you love them no matter what every single day. That's how you don't pass down trauma. But situationally, for sure, we're going to pass some of it down, and we need to not be so hard on ourselves, because that only creates that cycle of continuing to focus on doing that instead of focusing on, okay, yeah, I messed up here. How do I improve what I've done? And how do I acknowledge that? How do I make it better? And how do I allow my child to know nobody is perfect, not me either. And that's okay. We're all human, and we have to love ourselves through that. It can be a teachable moment, right? It can be an example of it's okay to falter and then stand up and take ownership. How you handle it is what makes it important and okay.
Yeah, well, great. I'm glad that you answered that. Okay, so another thing, I have a couple of ideas, but I'm like, which one should I do first? So I'll go with the second one. So we were talking about the triggers with the legal system, and one of the things is that there's this there's the triggering of the old wounds, and a lot of people feel like, why can't I just show up when I know I have the capability to? Like, why can't I just do this right? So can you explain also how our brains function during a time like this?
Yeah. So, when something is triggered, it's bringing you into that part of your brain that's just reacting and going into survival mode. And you really needed that in especially our situations growing up as children of abuse. All we could do was react. We couldn't logically assess the situation because it's the primal part of your brain that's just keeping you safe and alive, or at least getting through that traumatic experience. Well, when we're triggered, it's going back to that same primal part of your brain. And I kind of like to say it's like this part is really alive and firing, and the part you really need has just taken a nap. It's not there. And physiologically, like, that's not your fault. And it's important to recognize that, because this part, the primal part, is always going to get the bigger part of the attention. It's going to be the part that shows up first, which is why I say you have to practice the pause. And you have to allow yourself the moment of, okay, however you're reacting, maybe you're freezing, maybe you're fawning, and you just want to go, yes, I agree with you in everything you say. And inside you're going, no, I don't. Take a moment and just go, okay, I just need a moment. Let me think about that, whatever the word is. But really what you're doing is you're practicing the pause, and you're giving your brain an opportunity to wake up on this side so that you can take that breath and go, okay, I'm safe. I'm okay. I can respond to this.
Yeah, and what you're saying is what we also do with our clients when we do coaching in terms of presentation, and we'll go over how to be a good witness. And one of the things that we talk about is that often the opposing counsel, we know, will bully you. And one way they do it is they pick up the pace when they're asking you what's called rapid fire questioning. Mm-hmm. And so when this happens, our tendency is to meet that pace and like try to answer as quickly as possible. And so what you're saying with doing the pause, that's exactly what we say, is like, you need to make sure that you control the pace. Like, just because someone is coming at you with all these questions doesn't mean you need to answer that quickly. You can slow it down by saying, let me think about that. Mm-hmm. I need a moment. Or even, can you just repeat the question? I want to make sure I understand it. Like, these are all things that you have control over, even though you're in the situation that feels out of control. Yeah. That's a way to slow it down. And like you said, it also gives your brain a chance to think of a good response instead of just that knee-jerk emotional, like, oh, I gotta perform, I gotta do what this other person wants me to do.
I want them to like me. I want to get it right. I want to get it right. I want to get it right. That's the survival thing. You have to make them meet you where you are, where you want to be, not where they're trying to pull you, right? And if you're aware, like what you're talking about, if you're aware that that's what they're going to do, then it empowers you. It helps you to be able to slow down, because you know that they're trying to, to trick you and to pull you into a direction where you're completely flustered. One of my favorite questions to ask anybody on the planet whenever something's coming at you is, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? Because that buys you time. And also, when they repeat the question, it's not going to be what you think you heard. It's going to be what they meant by the question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. I was thinking okay, wait, I had like several thoughts at once, but with the, well, let me just move to the next question. It's going to come back to me as soon as I start asking it. But you had done a post about the holidays coming up. I know this isn't quite the legal thing, but but what you said just made me think of it, where someone will ask you about if you're spending time with your family, and that most people get like really uncomfortable with questions. Okay, now I just remembered the other thing I was going to ask. I knew it was going to. All right, so back to the presentation thing, because it goes together. Yeah. Okay, so we talked about slowing down the pace, but I was going to say another thing which ties back to what you said and what we just talked about with awfulizing is what we'll do with our clients is say, they're always like terrified of going to court because you're on the stand. Again, it's unfamiliar, it's scary, everything else. And we'll say, well, what's the worst question? Like, what's the worst thing that they could ask you? What are you worried about? Like I'm going to be exposed. Like I used to be a drug addict and I'm afraid that they're going to use it against me. You say, okay, let's say that they are going to ask you that. Instead of like being scared it's going to happen, let's just say it's going to happen. How can we prepare for that? How can we spin it and talk about, yeah, I was a drug addict in the past and here's what I've done to show how long I've been. So here's what I've done. Here's the progress I've made in my life. And so that also helps calm people down. Because instead of just like, what if, I hope they don't, it's just like, no, let's just plan that it's going to happen and address it. It's almost like taking those dark things out and putting them right out there.
Yeah, I mean, they are going to ask if there's a dark secret in there. That of course they're going to go in for that. I mean, they're going in to do the thing that you're so used to people doing, which is destroy your character, right? So it's not about the thing that you did. It's about what did you do as a result of the thing, what life lesson did you learn from that? How did it develop you into a better person? Because clearly, for example, if you were addicted to drugs, you had to work really, really hard to shed that, right? And to heal from that. So the positive spin on that would be, yeah, I was. And it took me a lot of hard work and a lot of, introspection to learn how to do things in a healthier way so that I could show up as a better human being, not just for myself, but for my children. And now because of that bad experience, I'm actually stronger and more well-equipped because I did the time in therapy to work on myself to be the best person I can be. See what a different, oh, you're a drug addict. No, well, I was, but this is who I am.
Right. And it actually makes people look better in court when they can tell a story like that.
Yeah.
Like often someone will be assigned anger management class and they're like, oh, I'm going to look so bad. But instead they look better because they're like, I completed everything I was supposed to do. I'm fine. I've done what you've asked me to do. So now I deserve the opportunity to try again.
I've demonstrated my level of commitment and my openness to improving as a person, which means I'm improving as a parent.
Exactly. Okay, so now I'm going to connect the thread that I started before, which was being asked uncomfortable questions. So you had recently done this post, and I think I had reposted it on my feed about, the holidays are coming up and people say, oh, are you going to be spending time with your family? And a lot of people dread, a lot of our people who are no contact, dread questions like that. So talk about that a little bit.
So, I mean, I've been no contact for the most part for over 30 years, particularly with my mother. There was a little blip in there where she showed up, and that's a story for another day, but it lasted like a millisecond. In the beginning of my, thank goodness, in the beginning of my no contact journey with her, though, I had my kids and they would be going to school and there's other parents and they're like, oh, what are you doing for the holidays? Are you seeing your family? Are you, it's all about family at the holidays and all about the parents and the grandparents and that sort of thing. And back then I would just give very vague answers because of the fact that I was terrified that they would know that I didn't have a relationship with my mother in particular and see me as a bad daughter. I didn't have like the language of, I'm not close with my family. Like it's a very different response now, but our inclination is to give information that doesn't belong to anybody else, that we don't owe anybody else, and then be worried about the judgment that we're going to receive based on the judgment we were raised receiving, right? What I do with questions like that now, depending on the relationship, I mean, I have no problem about it, but depending on the relationship, I might just say, yeah, I'm just not seeing, you know, my mother or my father. I'm not going to go. I'm no contact, blah, blah, blah. Or I might say, yeah, we don't really have a relationship. Unfortunately, that relationship was very abusive in my childhood. And just leaving it there. We forget we don't owe people an explanation.
Yeah. Marnie, you had said something else that I want you to elaborate on how, and it has to do with the island. You said you watched the person's response
Oh,
to.
okay. Yeah, yeah. So if it's a person that when I say, yeah, like I just don't really have a relationship and they're supportive of that, maybe they're not digging in or they're like, hey, if you want to talk about it, you can talk about it. If not, it's all good. They stay on my island. They're my people. Like it's these questions and the way that a person responds to these questions is a great barometer for who you want to have on your island. If a person leans in with judgment or is, oh, you only have one mother or whatever that judgment is, they're off my island because what they're demonstrating to me is they are judgmental, they lack empathy, and that they are showing me an unsupportive toxic behavior. Why would I want to keep somebody like that on the island? Moreover, I'm like, thank you for letting me know who you are because now I don't invest time with you. I may come across you, but I know you're not a person that I would trust with my life. And I don't need that interaction.
Yeah, great answer. So another thing that we didn't talk about last time, but we've talked about in between is grandparents' rights. What, I don't know if you have any advice. I mean, there's laws and then there's actual what's happening. So we started this conversation talking about how toxic exes sometimes align with the grandparents who are no contact with our client. How do you know about situations like this, and how do you suggest people deal with that when they're getting all this pressure? I'm giving an example of like the ex who says, oh, I'm taking our child to visit your parents because family's important to us, and it's just too bad that you don't want to be part of it. But I think it's really important to, and then using one of the custody factors of the court, I think it's really important for our child to have relationship with extended family.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, and it depends on who you're divorcing or who you are divorced from. And I've had this experience in my own life with and I have permission from my daughter. My daughter's ex-husband trying to do that with my grandsons and my mother. And
oh wow.
oh yeah, and but my daughter, she laid down the law and she said, that's not your grandmother, that's my grandmother, and I have nothing to do with her. And our children actually don't want anything to do with her, but they grew up in that environment. Unfortunately, you know, as I know, there are situations where the only way you're going to be able to prevent that is by going to court, right? In the situations where you've got grandparents involved like that and you can't avoid that, you really need to make sure, like if they're going to do it anyway and there's no way and you can't get the court involved or whatever it is, you really need to be diligent with your children to be having conversations with them about their grandparents, about what the dynamic is, about the reasons why you're no contact in an age appropriate way so that they aren't getting, you know, sucked in to those relationships in a way where they're just open because they're grandma and grandpa and all, you know, they're going to start doing that triangulation game. I lose my mind every time I see, you know, a grandparent gaining rights to children. And I'm not talking about like, I mean, there's situations obviously in my mind where a spouse dies and the other one goes on with their life and they don't want those grandparents apart. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about relationships where there was abuse, where the adult survivor is no contact and the grandparent is suing for rights. I have a massive problem with that because of the fact that if they abuse one child, they are going to abuse the next child. And when it's emotional abuse, we know it's very hard to pin down and prove. So they're going to, you know, it's a very complicated issue. I mean, you know, from a client that we've shared, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that she was personally, so being that there's no names involved, I had a client, or have on and off a client who was really giving her mother a lot of things because her mother was threatening her with court. But then when certain things came out in documentation, her mother leaned back, but she was still kind of giving her the same things with very little boundary that she had the power to put in place, because she was triggered by her mother, is what I think, and giving her far too much. And the minute that you start to do that, you're opening the door wider, not just in a legal sense, but in an emotional bonding sense for that child to see that there's something not quite right. And how that translates when that child becomes a teenager and they're pushing back against the parent, that grandparent leverages that time. And that's why so many kids get lost to the narcissistic grandparent, because they're able to pull them to them going, yeah, I know your mom is really bad. Just because you were out, you know, until 2 a.m. What a bad mother you have. What teenager isn't going to be sucked in by that, right? So I always, like, if you're no contact or you're low contact, I always advise, if a client has a child involved with the grandparent, supervision, even in phone calls. Know what's being said, know what's happening. Don't be complacent about it, because a child is no match to somebody who is emotionally grooming and twisting them around.
Right, especially as they get older. I mean, they've been doing it for a longer period of time, so they're very skilled at it. And then I think kids tend to feel guilty. They feel like I need to do, this is my grandparent, I need to do what they want me to do.
Yeah,
you know, I
well, and
respect their authority.
They're also groomed in this way of, you know, when a grandparent like this is using that triangulation, all through that, they're planting little seeds in that child's head that there's something quite not right about your mother. She's a little not so smart. She's a little bit. So when they plant these seeds, it isn't as much as to draw them into the grandparent as it is to create division and a lack of trust between the child and that parent. And that's why the division is such an easy thing for them to do, because they've been peppering all that stuff in there all along.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's just so insidious.
Yeah, and methodical and on purpose. Yep.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Another thing that came up in the past is, and it happens all the time when you are no contact with people in your family, is people saying, well, why don't you just get over it? You knew I would ask you this one.
I have my spare jar. Like, why don't you get over it? Yeah, I would love to get over it. Let me know how I do that. Let me know how I get over all of the childhood trauma that my parent put me through. If I can wave a magic wand and stop remembering all the things that were done to me, not happened, all of the abuse, if you can tell me how I get over that, let me know. What they're really saying is, I'm uncomfortable with your trauma. I don't believe you. They're invalidating you, and they are a person who is off the island, as a matter of fact. Right? Because it isn't reasonable to tell somebody who's been through trauma to just get over it. And a person who's going to say something like that, there's something going on with them. It's not about us. Yeah.
Right. Right. And I think it's good for people to remember that, because we're always like, we want this person to like me and I want to give them information. I got to explain myself.
Oh my gosh.
You don't have to.
Yeah. Well, not only do you not have to, but a person who says get over it, you should not, because that's a person who's going to weaponize that information and weaponize your trauma and turn it back on you. That isn't a person who's demonstrating that they're worthy of your emotional investment or trust. So instead of operating from this point of, I want to be worthy of them, it's important for us to shift and look at people and decide, I don't like the worthy word, but I'm going to use it for the sake of this. They're worthy of us. Are they trustworthy? Are they somebody that we can invest our emotions in? How are they reacting to my trauma, to the things that I'm sharing? Somebody who is invalidating you, you may want to prove to them that they're wrong in invalidating you by giving them more of your trauma story. But
Right.
that's not what it's doing. What it's doing is giving them information that I can promise you down the road they're going to use to hurt you even further.
Right. And it also feels so uncomfortable to keep talking to someone like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it's good it feels uncomfortable because hopefully it stops you from doing it, right?
Right. Right. Yeah. So so remember that. And so speaking of that, another pressure that we put on ourselves is there's this myth that amicable co-parenting is the norm. And that when you split up from someone, even if they were abusive to you, that for the sake of the kids, you should be sitting together at events. You should be trying to put up a front that you get along, and just pretending like everything is okay.
Yeah.
So what's your opinion of that, and how does that affect you?
You should be teaching your children that it's okay for somebody, even if it's their parent, to abuse you, and you just have to be nice to them anyway. That's a great life lesson for your kids, to learn that they can accept the same kind of treatment and just get over it and not have boundaries. You know, that's basically what people are telling you to do. They're not understanding that the example, first of all, you have the right to keep yourself safe. You have the right to create boundaries, and you have the right to feel comfortable in your experience with enjoying your children at these events. And not sitting together doesn't take away from that experience. Sitting together with a parent, and you know, children know when their parent is being abused by the other parent. With an abusive parent, is like showing your children that no matter what somebody does to you, you know, you can accept it and you have to suck it up. And it's okay to keep it real. You know, it's okay to say, listen, you know, mommy and daddy are divorced for a reason. We don't share a life together for a reason. I love you, and I know you'd like us to sit together because you want to look like everybody else, which these days is less and less and less. I get that, but I'm very uncomfortable with that. So, you know, you can go back and forth freely. You can enjoy both of us, but this is my boundary, and this is what's healthy for me. And having that conversation and letting them tell you their feelings, you know, because obviously keeping that line of communication open between the healthy parent and that child is really going to help them build their trust and respect for you when the things do hit the fan. Because we know when we divorce somebody who is abusive, the abuse doesn't stop with us, right?
Oh, yeah, we know very well.
Yeah. I mean, there is no co-parenting with them. There is only creating boundaries for our children and doing the best that we can to uphold those boundaries. It's not a co-parenting relationship. If it were, you probably wouldn't have been divorced in the first place.
Yeah, yeah. So this brings me to the question that's everybody wants to know the easy answer to. Why do kids align with a toxic co-parent? Why does this happen? How can this happen? What can we do about it?
Well, I mean, okay, so you were an adult and you married the toxic co-parent and you were no match for them. Now your child, who is born into the world to them, is supposed to be a match to their manipulation. It's impossible, right? And that co-parent is grooming that child all the way through. And that child is going through that same conditioning that likely you went through that got you in that relationship, of that push and pull. And that kind of alignment. I'm your best friend this week, but now I'm not because you're being nice to your mother and sending all of those messages. So it's not that they're aligning with that parent. It's that they're working overtime to be accepted and loved by that parent. They don't have to do that with you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Any suggestions for the parent who's being rejected and is feeling like this kid hates me and all I care about is them, and their other parent doesn't care about them, but they're just so hurt?
Yeah. Well, I think when the other child comes back and you're doing that sort of detox thing that's happening, because a lot of times in those situations, like the first, day or two, the child comes back, you get the cold shoulder kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's just, you kind of have to find a way to kind of love at a distance a little bit and give them that space and not ask invasive questions, but do ask questions like, hi, how are you doing? Like, how was your time with your dad? Did you have a good time? You know, kids will give you different messages along the way, and asking them how they feel about things. And what, my favorite line, what do you mean by that? Because they'll give you information, checking in, knowing that something isn't quite right. But if you tell them, hey, that's not right, now you've trashed the other parent in their little mind, right? But if you're kind of saying, well, how do you feel about that? Or what do you mean by that, while you're getting that information? Oh, I'm glad that you had a good time in this way. Do you want to talk about this thing? And drawing them in without, without browbeating them, you're building a trusting interaction with them. You're showing them by demonstration that you are the safe parent, and that parent is not doing that. So being that safe, consistent, non-reactive, even though you feel so rejected in that moment, kind of parent, and pushing through it, ultimately they do come back around.
Yeah, and also that kind of questioning is such a contrast to what they often get from the other side, which is grilling.
Yeah. How do you feel? Did you have a good time?
Not what did you do? Who were you with?
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah. Did you have fun? Did you enjoy? Things that show you that you care about their experience from a feeling point of view rather than a reporting point of view.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Okay. Another thing actually, here's a quick one that I think somebody wrote on your post that is unrelated to some of this, but I want to make sure we answer it. Somebody said, what do you do when you get a narcissist as a client?
I don't.
I know it's out of nowhere, but I was like, we said we're going to answer questions, and that one came in first.
So far, so good.
Yeah, you haven't gotten any? You don't think?
No, I've had a couple of times where I've had somebody that I know that there's something going on, but I'm not necessarily thinking that they're a narcissist. And I mean, the relationship has to be reciprocal, right? I'm not dealing so much with clients where, like, I'm doing, for example, I do some family work, but I'm not doing couples counseling. I'm doing a lot of individual counseling. Mm-hmm. There are times when I get a client who has narcissistic traits, for example, but I haven't so far, knock wood, had somebody who is a narcissist. And typically that's not going to happen because they're not going to seek out therapy. If I thought, I'm not a diagnostician, but if I thought somebody was really, like, NPD, I would refer them out to somebody else who could specialize in where they are, because I'm not qualified to treat that. That's not my wheelhouse, and I don't really want to. I don't want to go down that path. Like, the beauty of what I do is I get to decide, it's a mutual decision, obviously, but decide who I'm going to work with. And that's based on whether or not I feel like I can make a positive impact in that person's life. And I can't see being able to do that in the life of a narcissist. So.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Us too. We don't, like, people will say, like, what are your rates? I'm like, we don't publish our rates. You need to have a call with us first, because we need to sort of screen and make sure that it's okay.
Yeah. And
you can't just hire us.
Yeah. I mean, you can get me for one session for sure, or a consultation session, and I'll do that. But in terms of, like, buying a package and coming in on a longer term, I'm not going to do that without an individual, like, one of first, because again, I don't know where you are. You don't know where I am. Maybe we don't click. Maybe it's as simple as that. Maybe it's not so much about a personality disorder as we just don't, have that mutual trust, right? That thing, in which case we shouldn't be going through a therapy journey together, because it is a together project,
Yeah. I mean, this stuff is intense too.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Okay. So let's now talk about the issue of trust. So after being in one of these horrible relationships, not just the ex, but growing up with this, people always say, how can I learn to trust myself? Like, what signals can I use to start learning how to cope? And we know a lot of people say, oh, I'm good. Like, I'm done with other relationships because, I can't put myself
I'm going to go self-isolate over here where it's nice and safe, right? That's a
I call myself independent. I'm independent.
Yeah, that's self-reliant. Yep, we know that. First of all, we're kind of groomed to think that if we don't trust people out of the gate blindly, like, we're bad people. we're jaded, we've been negatively impacted. So our early childhood kind of wiring is that we should give everybody the benefit of the doubt. We should tell everybody everything. We should trust, 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 trust. Because if we don't, like, there's something wrong with us. We're taught that. That's the pre-grooming, right? And then so what happens? We end up in one of these horrific relationships, and now I'm not going to trust anybody. Well, that's not working either. What I like to say is neutral trust. You know, getting to know somebody at a pace that is comfortable, not familiar, that feels comfortable to you, and checking in with how that person makes you feel. So for me, for example, I might go out for a drink with somebody, and I may check in at that moment at some point in time, or I might, like, when I get home, go, oh, that person was really great, and da da da, and yeah, I think I want to see them again. Next thing you know, I'm not sleeping so well that night. That's my measurement of, ooh, something must have struck me in that I missed. But you know, your dopamine is going and your hormones and all of that. So the other thing that I always say, especially in dating, is don't date back to back to back. Take a couple of days so all of those wonderful chemicals can kind of settle down and you can check in with yourself. We forget that the instincts that we had during childhood, the intuitions that we had, even the coping mechanisms, those survival mechanisms, actually kept us alive. They are valid. What invalidated them was the people around us, but those feelings that you have were never invalid. You just learned to stop listening to them and trusting them. So it's really important to come back and be conscious of, how do I feel about that? For me, you know, am I eating funny, like differently than I would, or having mock conversations? Do I feel like I have this anxiety? There's something I didn't get to say, and now I'm ruminating over it. What that's actually telling you is you've picked up something very subtly that is prickly for you. Listen to that. You don't need to dive in. You don't need to give a second chance. You're not going to know what you didn't miss, right? Go in slow. Somebody who is not willing to share all of their information in exchange for all of your information is a person who's on the same page, where you're coming in and getting to know each other slowly. Somebody that's digging in and trying to find out all about your past and your relationships right out of the gate, that's a gigantic red, I can't even speak. It's a gigantic red flag. Right. Because they're trying to get into your psyche. They're not actually trying to get to know you. We are not our trauma. We are the people who we, where we operate from. You know, we are not a trauma response. We are kind, we are loving, we are generous, we are what our character is, what our integrity is. Our trauma is not what defines us. And somebody who digs around to try to find out where your soft spot is not somebody who doesn't mean to do you good harm. You know, that's somebody who's looking into, oh, I just want to get to know you. No, they're looking for information to weaponize. So go in neutral. Don't give too much information. Have them earn your trust. You need to earn their trust.
Yeah, you made me think of a couple of things. So we also mentioned last time there's this idea, a myth of love at first sight, but that I've heard that love at first sight is actually a danger signal because your body's producing adrenaline and it's actually warning you like something is scaring you, but our society romanticizes it.
Yeah.
Like, so when you start feeling powerful attraction, be careful.
Yeah, well, because what that's at, and it's the butterflies, right? So basically all that's telling you is that you are with somebody who is familiar to what you learned in childhood, what your childhood experience was. And there's a weird sort of fear mixed with comfort in that, a familiarity. Mm-hmm. Somebody who doesn't make you feel those things right out of the gate, but you can talk and be yourself and you're not really thinking about what you're going to say next. Like you're just kind of flowing through the conversation. That's comfort. And no, you may not be all giddy out over the moon kind of thing, but you're likely going to be like, wow, that was really nice and interesting. Look for the comfort, not the familiarity.
Yeah, and I think I shared with you during our last conversation that, so my partner and I, with Been There, Got Out, Chris, we've been a couple in real life for 7.5 years. But when we first met, in person, it was like, no, like not, like there was not the attraction level at all. So I was kind of like, oh, well, but we already had arranged to have lunch. So we ended up spending the next 2 hours just talking, very enthusiastically. And at the end of that date, and thank God he didn't try to kiss me or hug me or shake my hand, because I wasn't ready for anything like that day. But I sat in the car and I thought, I did that check-in. I was like, that was actually fun. Like, I had a good time. I feel comfortable. And I never in my life had done that, which sounds so ridiculous because I was in my 40s when that happened.
Yeah.
But it was like I needed to check in. And I'm glad that I did, because things did progress slowly after that, and they have lasted.
Yeah.
But I think I in the past for me is I let myself be led by somebody else's feelings, especially the intense feelings, like, oh, they're so interested in me and they want to know so many things. Like, I should feel flattered. I should feel honored that they think that I'm worthy of getting to know better. When, like what you said, someone's digging for information, why?
Yeah.
Why do they need to know all this stuff?
Why do you need to know that? And the other part is that because a lot of times children who are raised in abusive environments have such a tremendous fear of abandonment, and there's so much anxiety attached to that. Love bombing is awesome for us because it gives us this sense of, I know where I stand. He really likes me. And oh yeah, he's all in. And you don't have to worry about those feelings of abandonment. You don't even have time to focus or think on them. But when you start to date somebody who's actually healthy and taking things slow and opening up over time and expecting or hoping that you do the same, the space in between there without that love bombing can be terrifying. Because you're like, well, they didn't call me. I wonder if they're mad at me today. Like that, we go to something we did wrong. Maybe that makeup I wore, like we go into that whole thing. So it's a new training to actually date with intention and to date somebody who isn't all in, who isn't looking like they're love bombing and showing up right out of the gate, and learning how to provide our own safety in those times in between, and also keeping ourselves busy enough to not get too attached too early without letting things grow at a healthy pace.
Yeah, and one thing that people don't realize is that sometimes it can feel boring. In a healthy relationship. You want to talk about why? And I see we're almost at an hour. As usual, Marnie, it's flying by, so we got to finish in the next couple minutes. Well, but just briefly, like, why would it feel boring?
Because safe is boring because safe isn't doing this to our hormones. Safe isn't exciting. And
you've never had safe.
And if you've never had it, if you've never been like in a consistent environment where safe feels good and comfortable, then it's going to feel negative, whether that's boring or it creates some other sort of anxiety. I mean, we do that to ourselves, right? How many times in our own lives where everything is going on all great, and all of a sudden, we do something to self-sabotage ourselves. What we're really doing is going, well, I feel safe. This is really uncomfortable. I don't know how to live in safety. And I do know that if I pull the plug and create some chaos here, like the valve is released, because if I don't do it, someone else is going to do it, because that's what our childhood was. When in truth, life has ups and downs, but you can also just kind of coast and be safe. Like, give me boring, like, give me damn boring.
Yeah.
Boring.
Now, another thing that you said, and I want to end with this again, is we were talking about being distrustful earlier. Some people just say, I'm good. I don't even want to try anymore. But that you think about what someone in your past has already taken from you.
Yeah. I mean, how much more are you going to give that person? So now you are going to deprive yourself of the possibility of connecting to beautiful people, to being loved, to being able to give love, because they're equally as beautiful. Well, you just handed them the whole rest of your life. You just gave it over to them. Now you're doing it willingly. how much more do they get to take away from you? Like they took that chunk of time, then they took the chunk of time where you have to start healing, working through this, and also in this case being involved in the legal system. Now they get the rest of your life. Why? I think when you look at it that way, it's like, oh wait, you know, that's not really what I deserve. That's what they want me to be. You know, living well is the best revenge, right?
Absolutely.
Not that I need.
So Marnie,
you know.
how can people find you?
So, well, aside from here and aside from
Yeah.
on TikTok, you can find me at Marnie, MARNIE, speaks.com. Or if you just go to my bio page here on Instagram or any of the other social media platforms, I have a link tree and it's got all my information there. You can email me or you can go to my website, set up a session if you'd like to do that. I also practice EMDR therapy, so you can kind of look at that and see if that's something that you're interested in. And yep, that's how you can find me.
Okay, great. And I'm like, okay, next conversation, if you ever want to have another one of these lives, we need to talk about EMDR. EMDR.
Yeah.
Yes. All right. So we'll set a date for that. But thank you so much again for coming back on and recreating sort of what we did before.
Yeah, I think it's been great. Thank you so much for having me.
All right. You're welcome. Bye.
Bye.